Hello and welcome to I think this is part 5 now of the Smash Lord. And we have the this side of the hammer. This was the side of the hammer that I actually recorded, but the recording was lost. So we're now going to do the rear side. I'm going to do the same on the rear side. So the paints that we're using, the paints that you can see on the palette there, we have they're all Vallejo model color paints. So we have olive green, Vallejo yellow green, which is a gorgeous colour. It doesn't really have any equivalent in Citadel. You can get it a little bit from Uriel yellow with a little bit of moot green in it. Ice yellow and ivory over on the left hand side, right hand side, sorry. These the kind of highlight the positions and where we're going to get the colour here. You can see we've already kind of sketched it on a little bit with the olive green. Which is where we've got that black corner, but we're scrubbing this on, we're sketching this on now. The paints on the wet palette are very watered down. Again, they're about 50-50 water to paint, and that's really important because we're going to be building up slow layers of paint on this. We're wanting to keep them. All the paints here are pretty translucent as a paint themselves. So when you water it down, it gets even worse a little bit. So what we're kind of trying to work with that as well. So thinning the paint down so that we can build up the layers nice and slowly. Now, the lighting direction here, it's because the hammer is angled backwards. We're going to be hitting the bottom side of these, but we've got to remember as well that the hammer is its own light source as well. So we're going to have a little bit of a glow coming out from. Well, this is the power source in my head anyway. So that power source there is going to be very bright. So we're going to get everything kind of sketched in and some of the transitions sorted out. And then we'll glaze the transitions together a little bit, just to take a tiny bit of the paint texture off. So that's a texture in terms of the detail within the paint. So because we're building it up in layers like this, you can apply texture through the transparency of the paint. So it doesn't quite cover there. So that yellow green that I applied there, it doesn't quite cover over the olive green, so you get little kind of dots and speckles and different kind of colour variations. That's the texture I'm talking about, not like a 3D texture as if you're using like a thick paint. You're not getting brush marks as a 3D texture. You're getting brush marks on the paint as a paint texture, if you like. Anyway, so we're going to be building up that texture and then glazing it back just a little bit, just to knock it down a little bit, and then at the end we're going to use some contrast paints. We're going to glaze over some contrast paints as they act a little bit like big mistake there. They act a little bit like inks, so we can glaze a little bit of colour on. Now the olive green that I had there, I accidentally poured a little bit too much water on with a brush as well, so it just seeped into that centre. So very quickly you cleaned your brush, wiped it as much as you could quickly on the paper towel, and then you can just suck up that mistake. It just disappears. So we're working with the olive green to lessen the harsh transition down into the shadows. With all of this, always we're pulling away from the shadows as much as we can with this as well, with this kind of texture going on. And you'll see I'm dropping between the two colours, or the four colours, quite a lot here, kind of pulling them up and pulling them down. And this little edge, because this edge is pointing upwards. If you remember on the other side, if you notice on the other side, this edge was pretty dark because that edge is pointing downwards. So that one's pointing upwards, so we're going to have a little bit more light catching on it. Like I say, it's an interesting one, this, because it's a powered light source. So imagine the head of the hammer, the front of the hammer, if you like. Imagine that as a little bit like a power sword. and then the light source, the power source at the back of the hammer here. This is where it's going to be really, really bright. So you can see this is this is the ice yellow and a little bit of ivory, and we sketched out a little bit of texture on there, and we're just kind of filling it in and pulling it together with the yellow green. You'll notice I kind of go back to the yellow green quite a lot, because it tends to soften the other two paints down into itself quite well. So you can really pull it around. It does take a little bit of practice getting this kind of paint pulling technique. It's taken me a little bit of a while, particularly with these paints as well, because these paints are a little bit of an awkward one to work with. But I will put Games Workshop equivalents as well in the description of this video. The Games Workshop equivalents, you could arguably they'd probably be a little bit better to use, because they thin down so well. Games Workshop paints, like inherently they seem to thin really well, which is why I like using them for glazes a lot. I've got a little bit of Abaddon black up in the top of the wet palette here from painting yesterday as well, which I do glaze on right at the end, but I do that off camera, just to pull a little bit of more shadow into some of the areas and pull it away from the olive green. So the white, the ivory, it's a nice warm white. It's perfect colour for this, really. So we're just kind of using that to enhance any edges. And that edge in the middle in particular, that's one of the edges which I've glazed back with Abaddon black, so that contrast between that ivory white and the black on the other side is nice and stark, because that will sell that nice little kind of powered glow as you get on power weapons and things. So you can be quite aggressive with the white as well, because it also it doesn't, this particular white, well, it's ivory, but this particular paint, it doesn't dry particularly quickly compared to the other paints. It is thinned down a little bit further, so you can kind of throw it on quite roughly like this, and then go back to like the yellow green, as you'll see I'm doing here. There we go. You can go back into the yellow green and kind of pull it out and kind of wet blend it on the model quite well. It's a really good paint for that. You can see I'm really working on trying to get that top of the hammer really bright around this light source, and I'm even though the light source has got that black shadow around the center of it, which I might brighten. I might put a very thin glaze of olive green in there, just to kind of pull a bit of colour into that black shadow. But that power source, I'm going to make sure is pretty much all at least yellow green, and then up to white, and we can even start trying to paint some very small lightning strikes across it in the ivory as well. So olive green again, just kind of pulling up away from the shadows, but just lessening that transition. And I've done a few kind of power sources and weapons in this scheme now, and it's really important that you get one done, so that you can understand how much and how far you need to go with it in terms of the highlights. So the first time I did this, I was looking at it and it was looking so pale. I was like, oh, have I done it right? And I started sketching the yellow green back into it again, because it was going too pale and too off-white. But then you remember that you're going to glaze it over as well after it, once it's finished. So you can see the orb here has been painted in exactly the same way. That was a video that didn't record. So the orb has been painted in exactly the same way, but you can see the tonal difference in that it is much more yellow and green than the pale ivory of the hammer at the moment. So the important bit here is, if you squint at it, can you see the tonal difference, and can you see what you're trying to achieve on the hammer in terms of the tonal range and the tonal blend between the highlights and the shadows. And then once you've got that, once that works, then you can glaze the colour that you want into it. It's an interesting way of doing it. I like using these paints. These paints have given me a little bit more control of what I'm trying to do, and then obviously you can glaze as much or as little as you like to get the eerie yellow and then the eerie green kind of glow into it. A little bit too much on the paintbrush there, just kind of knock it off on my thumb. Again, so this is a reasonably new. It's a size 1 Da Vinci. If you do want to get some Da Vinci brushes, drop me a message and I can send you my affiliate link, so that you can just click straight onto the website that I get them from, and you can have those. But it's a size 1. It's got a reasonably sharp point on it, but you need to make sure that your brush is never overloaded, particularly when you're doing things like this, when you're getting this kind of really small paint texture. If I was doing this on a the size of a rhino or something, then I would be making sure that I was using a slightly larger brush. But because the size of the thing is very, very small, and therefore the detail that we want to add to it is exponentially even smaller than that, we need to have a paintbrush which is suitably sized. So a small paintbrush, a good tip to it, and then not very much paint on the brush at all either, because we don't want any blobs. We want a nice sharp point when we put the paintbrush to the model. You'll see sometimes I'm dropping the paintbrush onto my thumb just to wipe a little bit of the excess paint off, and sometimes I'm not. When I'm not, it's usually because I've picked up and wiped. So you can see on the paint blobs on the wet palette, there's kind of trails that are pulling away. As I pull that paint away, it thins out a little bit, because it's absorbing water from the wet palette. So as I'm pulling it away, I can then kind of thin it down even further if I want to almost kind of glaze some transitions together, which is what I'm doing here. I'm kind of pulling. You see, I'm scribbling, and that ice yellow is being glazed almost across all the transitions, just to pull them up a little bit brighter. Now, edge highlights on here. This is going. I think this is ice yellow. It might be ivory. I can't remember what I picked up. I think it's ivory actually. So transitions like this are really important. The edge highlights like that are really important to sell the transition as well. So if you edge highlight down, making sure that it goes all the way across all that transition from right up in the ice yellow, because the ivory isn't really close to the edge, but all the way up to the ice yellow, right down to the olive green. If you have that same edge highlight all the way down, passing all of those, it kind of pulls the transitions together and softens it down, almost like a visual trick sort of thing, a visual illusion, if you like. So it's one of the ways where you can pull things together, just to put some nice, neat, small little highlights on. So you can see the kind of the initial part of throwing as much paint down. Well, not throwing as much paint down, but being nice and quick and getting it sketched out quickly. That has now. You've kind of lost all that, or lost a lot of the kind of the rough texture that we had to begin with, and now we're really just finishing it off, pulling these edge highlights together. They really add a little bit, and just like I say, they pull those transitions together really well. Now this is a bit more of an ice yellow glaze. I thought I felt that the ivory and the ice yellow, sorry, the yellow green glaze. I felt that the ice yellow and the ivory had just come down the hammer a little bit too much. So I'm just glazing over and just trying to pull that a little bit further back, tonally wise. And the same here. That transition between the dark olive green and the ivory is just a little bit too abrupt, so we're just getting a little bit of that olive green in, watering it down, having not much on my brush again. Look, it's as you can see, it's only got paint 2/3 of the way up the bristles, and it's definitely not full. It's not overloaded, there's not a big blob on the front, but you can see it's still making marks. So don't be afraid to not put much paint on your brush. As long as it's watered down, as long as you've got the consistency where it's still coming off the brush, then you're okay. So that's where we're going to finish. Oh, maybe no, we're still doing the edges highlights now. So going back on, this is the ice yellow, and we're just kind of sketching out some of the edge highlights on the darker side. So the edge highlights on dark sides are really important, again, to pull them together, but also to give that transition an end point. So it almost holds that panel together. If it didn't have it, then that panel would almost fall off the model, and you wouldn't be able to see it wouldn't have like a definite panel line, if you like. So I always try to edge highlight as much as I can roughly the same colour all the way around it. You can edge highlight a little bit brighter on the brighter side if you want to, but ultimately you want to try to be using roughly the same colour. And now we are going to pull in a little bit of a yellow-green glaze. I really do like this colour, it's really cool. It's a very unique colour. So we just did a very, very quick glaze that we made on the wet palette. We don't need, it's not a very big panel, so I don't need to make it in the well palette or anything. So it was remember the paint on the wet palette is already watered down, so that was 1:1, and then I pulled it out, put it on the wet palette, swirled it around a little bit, so that thinned it down a little bit more, and then I've put a couple of big blobs of water on there as well. So it's a nice thin glaze, just to help with that transition a little bit. You can see it's a little bit softer there already as we're going from the dark olive green through the olive green all the way up to the ivory. There we go again, just pulling that. Notice I'm not going too high on it. I have got that little bit in the recess again, which I hope I pull out in a second. There we go. Suck it out. And make sure that's black. So that needs to keep that contrast. Really needs to keep playing there. A little bit of a watermark was appearing there, so I just got rid of that, and then just glazing it over with a little bit of olive green to get rid of it. So this paint now, which I'm kind of finishing off, this is very, very thin. It's still got some marks. You can see I'm still creating marks with it, but it's still very thin. There's not a lot on my brush still. Just working on pulling the transitions together, ready for the next stage. The next stage is where we're going to start putting some colour onto it, or some colour back into it. You can see it's quite desaturated now. So I think this is just some more edge highlights up at the top. Yep. So ice yellow again, just up at the top. Again, that's these little edge highlights for panel lines and things are absolutely perfect. making sure this is nice and bright. So this is where the light source is going to be the first point of contact that the light source is going to be hitting with the hammer is just on this edge, so that needs to be very nearly the same tonal highlight as the light source itself, which is why we're highlighting that with a bit of the ivory, and then just pulling that glaze up to the corners as well to enhance the glow, as it were. Remember, this is all going to get glazed back, so we can glaze the hammer back a tiny bit further than the actual light source, so that maybe the hammer we can use a little bit more green on it. So the paints that we're going to use to glaze it, we have warp lightning contrast paint and the Iandan yellow contrast paints. These are two of the best contrast paints. Are really good for glazing. They've got a very cool consistency about them, like the surface tension about them. There's something about the gel that they're using to hold the pigments in suspension, which work really well with glazing. Now, if you haven't got contrast paints, you can use like the Daler-Rowney inks. So if you have like a yellow Daler-Rowney ink or a green Daler-Rowney ink, then you can use those as well. If you do use the inks, or if you do use the contrast paints, make sure you water them down. This is about 10 parts water to 1 part paint. Knock it right back, because they are very, very bright. When you get them on your brush, they exactly the same as you would with glazing, but just be even more aware of it. Fill your brush up. I'm using a size 2 now, so fill your brush up, wipe it off. You can see it doesn't look like it's got any paint on it there at all. So and already you can see the wet mark as I'm putting it down. So it's just make sure it's nice and empty of paint. You will still have plenty of. There we go. So we've only put 1 coat on, and you can already see it's kind of the yellow tint to it is starting to pay off. Yeah, be very, very careful with this. Thin it down. It's a lot better to thin it down further than you think, and then put 2 layers on or 3 layers on, rather than make it too heavy, because then it's very difficult to get off, because it does stain quite quickly. So yeah, make sure that you fill your brush up with the contrast paint or the watered down glaze. I'm just blowing it off camera there just to try it out, because if I glazed over it again, then I would be pulling the pigments and ripping the pigments off the painted surface. So just make sure that it dries. It's quite cool to just blow. But yeah, so you pick it up on the brush, you wipe it off. I make sure that I've got, when I'm doing glazes like this, I make sure that I've got a part of the kitchen towel that is wet, because then when I see that's a little bit heavy. When I wipe the glaze off the brush, it pulls a little bit more off, in a way that maybe sometimes a dry paper towel doesn't quite do as well. So you can already see we've only put 1 coat on of both, and we can already see it's kind of pulling that tone to a little bit more of that eerie green that I really like, that's on the orb on the pommel. So just going back in again with the yellow. Remember the hammer itself needs to be a little bit paler than the light source, which is why we're trying to knock that ivory and the ice yellow down a little bit. So just pulling that glaze up to the top as much as we can. And there we go. So that is the latest part of this series. I hope you enjoyed that one, and we'll come back very, very soon, and we will address some of the true metallic. Thank you very much, guys. See you later. Take care and stay safe.